Good afternoon and welcome to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. My name's Hunter Farrell and I direct the World Mission Initiative here at Pittsburgh Seminary. We're really glad that you've taken time out of your day, out of your schedule, to join us for this important conversation. The work we do at Pittsburgh Seminary is grounded in faith and formed in community. And this afternoon and this evening are no exception to that rule. We trust that through this experience, you will feel yourself grounded in the truth of Jesus Christ and formed in community. First, a few housekeeping items. For our online students and guests, welcome. We would invite you to enter your name into the chat feature and let us know where you're dialing in from. Feel free to use that chat function throughout the lecture to engage with questions and forward those questions, and we'll be sharing them with Dr. Tran in just a bit. For our in-person folks, students and attendees, we welcome you and want you to know that the bathrooms are located down one level on the mezzanine level of this building. The elevator is just up the ramp and to the right as you leave. Let me say a word, if I may, about the person after whom this lecture is named. William Donald McClure was born in Blairsville, Pennsylvania in 1906 and was educated at Westminster College and graduated from here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in 1934. He was a Presbyterian missionary in the Sudan and Ethiopia for almost 50 years. Don McClure had a very special relationship and ministry with the people of these countries. He was also an excellent interpreter of the mission of God in context throughout Western Pennsylvania. He motivated many people to give their lives in missionary service. He motivated many people to give generously to the mission of the church, and he motivated many people to change the ways that they understood God was at work in the world. In part, this has all been reflected in the number of graduates from this seminary and its predecessor bodies who've entered into that aspect of the church's ministry, foreign mission as it was called in those days. Don McClure's ministry ended abruptly in 1977 when he was shot and killed in Ethiopia. He was buried in Ethiopia, where he had served Christ's church for almost all of his ministry. In light of this dedicated career, it was appropriate that many friends and supporters of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary came together and desired to enhance the worldwide mission of the church through some disciplined reflection on the mission of the church. Consequently, the seminary established the W. Don McClure Chair in 1977 and the W. Don McClure Lectureship in World Mission and Evangelism in 1982. This is a rich history that we're all a part of in a complex world that describes mission in ways that would be different from the ways that Don McClure would have understood them. Even so, we come together to think critically and faithfully about the mission of the church in these emerging times. I now invite Dr. Scott Hagley, the W. Don McClure Associate Professor of World Mission and Evangelism, to introduce our guest speaker. Scott, let's welcome him.
Good afternoon. It's good to be together, and it is really my privilege to introduce our 2023 McClure lecturer. Sorry about that. But I want to first take a step back and place our invitation to Dr. Tran in a broader context, because on the surface it might seem a little strange to invite someone writing about racial capitalism to an annual lecture on mission and evangelism. But I actually don't think it is. In recent decades, terms like mission and evangelism have rightfully fallen on hard times because of the ways in which missions and outreach efforts have uncritically embraced and participated in colonial and neo-colonial stories, practices, and systems. This critique is right and justified, and anyone taking a course on mission at PTS knows that we are here for it. But the question that guides mission and evangelism, or the questions that guide it, still persist. What in the world is God up to? How might we learn how to participate more fully in the ministry of God, in God's work for justice and peace? Where and how might our congregations bear witness to the good news of the gospel, the love of God in both word and deed? These are not academic questions that we ask at a distance. They're urgent and they're existential. And I think given the unravelings taking place in the United States and around the world, they are questions that force us to take account of the systems and the structures, the narratives and the practices that form and deform us in the modern world. In our American context, this means that we cannot really address questions about God's redemptive and reparative work in the world apart from interrogating the church's entanglement with whiteness and economic oppression, with race and with capitalism. So in his recent book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, Dr. Jonathan Tran invites us to think about the interconnections between racialization and capitalism, the ways that these processes deform our relationships with ourselves and with one another. And he does so with an eye to Christian theology and Christian community. In short, I think he's helping us work our way back to the urgent questions that we face regarding how we might witness to the good news and of the love of God. So that's enough from me. But in this greater context, want to invite Dr. Tran as the former George W. Baines Chair in Religion at Baylor University. He now serves as the Associate Dean of the faculty in Baylor's Honor College. I've learned a great deal from Dr. Tran's work. And so please, and I think you will too, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Tran to Pittsburgh Seminary and the 2023 McClure Lecture.
Well, great thanks to Scott, Professor Hagley, for that warm introduction, and to the broader PTS and Pittsburgh community. This is my first time in Pittsburgh, and your city is truly, really beautiful. So, and it is a great honor to give a lecture in the name of Donald McClure. I've had the opportunity to kind of study him and learn about his history and his work. He was a man who is truly ahead of his time in terms of how we think about the question of mission and more broadly the question of evangelism. So it is an honor to be here in this place speaking in the name of his lecture. As Dr. Hagley said, we are truly at a moment where the words missions and evangelism often come off with offense. Often come off as bad words or suspicious words. So how do we recover thinking about these questions? I think one key to understanding Don McClure is to understand the conditions of his martyrdom as an articulation that the gospel is something at the end of, in the final analysis, that can only be shown and shown in a life that says to this world, Jesus and the sharing of Jesus is worth more than anything this life can offer. So I'll be doing several things in this lecture today. I want to talk about mission and evangelism in the context of racial capitalism. And so I'm going to offer an account of racial capitalism, which I can't do except by pushing through what I will call a standard account of racism. This will help us understand what racial capitalism is and the great challenge it poses to humanity and specifically to the Christian church. I'll then offer an account of witness, of mission and evangelism, of how the church can be the church in that world as a way to offer an alternative to the powers and persistence of racial capitalism. I want to begin, though, by offering three, grammatical statements, three kinds of entailments and constraints of Christian speech about how we think about questions about missions and evangelism. And I'll offer this by way of three P's. So the first P is proclamation. When I say the grammar of Christian speech, I mean the basic logical constraints and extensions and entailments of how it is that we talk about Jesus in this world. The first part of that is something I'm calling proclamation. Christians and Christian speech fundamentally proclaims the gospel. It makes a strong claim about God and the world. Proclamation borrows on a basic metaphysics that our existence the life of creatures, is by their very existence, gift. Following Thomas Aquinas, God is the one whose essence is to exist. God cannot be God without existing. We creatures are the ones whose existence is contingent. Our essence is that we could exist or not. The fact that we exist grammatically means that our existence is simply a function of God's goodness and grace. So it is the very metaphysical nature of creaturely life to exist in the plenitude of the Trinitarian life. Our life is structured as gift. And so in our speech, whether it be uttered speech or the speech that we perform as creatures, we utter proclamation. Our very existence proclaims something about God. And so the question of, say, evangelism, of speaking about Jesus and speaking with such strength as to try to convince, to try to persuade, it is not a question of whether proclamation. Our existence itself is proclamation. We are saying in the very living of our lives, God is good. God is gracious. My existence, your existence, the existence of all of creation and the broad sweep of creation speaks to gift. And so we cannot not proclaim in whatever way we are, in whatever kind of creature we are, we proclaim something about God's goodness. So the question is not whether proclamation, it is more often what kind of proclamation. A good and faithful witness to the truth of God's gift in us, or a false and duplicitous one. This statement I've said about proclamation, that it is not a question of whether, is what I've said about proclamation is about the strong witness of evangelism. Of course, in this day proves controversial. And why? Because the witness of Christianity makes it, right, in its failures and its frailty, in its violence, in its sins of commission and omission, in its long histories, as Dr. Hagley talked about, of colonialism and colonial settlerism, of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of wars and the rumors of wars, all perpetrated both in the name of the church and in the name of the one who came to bring peace, undermines the Christian witness. And so as we grow increasingly self-conscious in our history of what the church has done badly, of what Christians in the name of Christ have done badly, then proclamation begins to wither. It looks weak, or if it is strong, it looks scary. And so proclamation has become a bad word. To proclaim, to carry the name of Christ with a strong voice cannot help but echo others who have carried that name with a strong voice and done violence in its name. And so we talk instead of the language of resistance. And I'm going to give you an account of racism and capitalism where resistance is going to feel like the primary key we should adopt, because resistance to racial capitalism feels like the properly attuned and humble response to a church that has done violence in its proclamation. And yet, I want to claim that the primary key of Christian witness is not resistance, it's proclamation. And unless it is proclamation, the revolution that the church is, that faithful discipleship enacts, cannot get off the ground. Right? We are different than other revolutionaries in this world. We are not, as they say, waiting for the revolution to start. We are bearing witness to a revolution that is at least 2,000 years old. It is proclamation, not resistance. We don't stand for God, and we do not stand with a God who might win. whose witnesses might conjure up enough strength and courage and ingenuity that they might win. Rather, we stand in the name of the one that not might win, not will win, has already won, has eternally won. That the winning is echoed in the Trinitarian life of God, such that the creation of us as gift is further reflection of that love that reverberates through all of creation. So the fundamental key of Christian witness is one of proclamation. It is what gets revolution off the ground. The second thing I want to say is that about evangelism and mission is a second P, presence, and specifically Eucharistic presence. We need to think about the night in which Christ is betrayed, the night of his betrayal, the night of his betrayal, not in the name of Rome and the empire, not in the name of the religious teachers who he wrestled with. Rather, his betrayal came from those most intimate and proximate to him. The betrayal of Christ on the night of his betrayal comes from his friends, his family. In fact, the very one on which he would build the church. And yet, on the night of his betrayal, he took the bread, broke it, and said, "Eat this. This is my body." The Eucharistic presence of God in the world is the giving of bread to a world that is starving. And whether that world is starving because of literal hunger, or whether it is starving because of hoarding, two sides of the same coin, Eucharist presence is the presence of God in the world that says, "I see that you hunger. And even in the midst of your betrayal, here's my body for the nourishment of the world." This presence is a presence that comes practically or not at all. It is a presence that feeds or not at all. It isn't a presence that is out there. There's this language in 1 John when the writer of 1 John says, we've heard and talked about this God out there, but the one we have is in here. We can see him, we can hear him, we can touch him. In the language of the Paradiso in the third book of Dante's Divine Comedy, we are so close to God, this presence so intimate that it is not a seeing, it is not just a hearing, it is not even just a touching, it is a tasting. The Eucharistic presence of God in the world to nourish the world. Now, just like the first one, proclamation is controversial in this moment, so is the second one, presence, because it has become the case that the presence of Christians, the presence of Christianity, the presence of those who came in the name of and to preach the gospel are again suspicious. Some of that is because the world is the world, and some of that is because the church has been what it has been. And so to preach the presence of Christ, especially through Christ's people who have betrayed not simply the world, not simply Jesus, but have betrayed themselves, to preach that presence is again something of controversy. And the third P, in terms of the basic grammar of everything else I want to say, is following proclamation and presence. I want to say that part of the grammar, part of the constraints and entailment of Christian speech is about proof. If the first two are controversial about Christianity, this third statement of mine will be controversial within Christianity, as a statement about the veracity and truthfulness of Christianity. And the claim is this: if the proof is not in the pudding of how Christians act and the church's presence in the world, then we, both Christians and non-Christians, have no good reason to believe that Jesus is the Christ. If the church doesn't at some level resemble the church portrayed in the New Testament, say in those critical verses between Acts 2 and Acts 4, if the church doesn't look something like that, then what's the point? I, like probably some of you in this room, was not raised in Christianity. First 20 years of my life, I was an atheist. That was just a function of my story and my family and how I came into the world. The default position cognitively for me is unbelief. I consider my life as a theologian as one of constantly searching for reasons to believe. The truthfulness of the Christian gospel is this: if there is not truthfulness to the church's proclamation, if there is not density and validity to its presence, if the history of Christianity and the church and the proclaiming of the mission and evangelism is just the violence, just the colonialism, just the racism, then we ought to give up the game. Then we ought to give up the game. The proof of the truthfulness of Christianity is in the pudding. We unfortunately worship a God for whom the doctrine of the incarnation bears very few abstractions. It's either the rubber meets the road. It's either the proof is in the pudding. It is either Christians are transformed by the Holy Spirit into a certain kind of faithful witness, or it is all a lie, a grand conspiracy, an elaborate mythologization of something that happened or didn't happen 2,000 years ago. For Christians, the proof is in the pudding. So those three things, the grammar of Christian speech, as I want to talk about evangelism and mission, is about proclamation. The primary key of Christian witness is proclamation, more so than even resistance. That the presence, the Eucharistic presence of God through God's given body, the bread, and by extension, all of us, the bodies gathered around the one given body. And three, that the proof is in those things, not abstractly, but practically. How are we literally feeding through the giving of our own lives the world? Now, this is just all throat clearing, ground clearing on the way to an account of the conditions of the world in which we proclaim or dare to proclaim the gospel. Now I want to talk a little bit about what racial capitalism is as a way to understanding what capitalism is and the dire challenge it presents to Christianity and the church. I'm going to talk about that for a little bit, and then I'm going to offer some comments about a particular church, also Presbyterian, like some of our traditions here, who have mounted a witness that looks something like proclamation, presence, and proof. So to get to racial capitalism, first let me offer what I think racism is not. And what you will find interesting is that my account of what racism is not happens to be what many of us think racism, in fact, is. And I want to say that one of the reasons we can be suspicious of this account of racism is because it is entirely too convenient. It gives an account of racism and racists as always something out there. Someone, not me. Something I see on the news, something I read in the past, someone I can tweet about, someone I call down and cancel. And all of that activity, often that goes in the name of an anti-racism, is too convenient. So let me start with the standard account of what racism is, or what I think it is not. So in this standard account, and let's call it the standard account, racism is something internal. It's something mental. It's something that happens, say, between my ears, behind my eyes, Stop the ghost in the machine that gives words that come out of my mouth. Maybe it's both in my brain and it's in my heart, but whatever it is, it's internal. It's personal. It has to do with, say, prejudices I have about certain kinds of people who look certain kinds of ways. It has to do with stereotypes through which I negotiate and conceptualize the world. It has to do with attitudes and beliefs that are wrong and yet powerful. In this account, I become a racist or I act racially or racistly insofar as I'm possessed of these bad beliefs and these attitudes, that there's stuff going on between my ears and behind my eyes that is bad source material. And the problem with the bad source material, things I believe, say, about Latinx communities, things I may believe about Black folks, things I may believe about white folks, things you may believe about Asian folks. This stuff is all back here, internal, the ghost in the machine. The problem with this racism, according to the standard account, is sometimes it acts out. Sometimes it escapes through my mouth, through my eyes, in the things I do with my hands. And when possessed of this racism, I do awful things. And you can look at the history of the world of racism to see the history of the awful things. Sometimes in this account of racism, this racist attitude, this racist belief, these racist stereotypes, prejudices, rise to the level of systems, right? They get in our structures. They affect our healthcare in negative ways. Maybe they even get into our housing, right? And in this image, you can imagine there's a racist. She's out there. She happens to work at a mortgage bank. She's combing through the list of potential candidates for a loan, and she sees a name. It looks like a Black name. She redlines it. And the problem for her is that she's possessed of this racist attitude. And you can think of all kinds of examples beside in this standard account of racism. Now, if that's what racism is, the anti-racism is pretty clear. The path forward makes clear sense. If racism is the product of bad source material existing in individuals, well, we have two strategies, two pathways in our anti-racism. One, we educate people. We get them to think different things about different people. If you're of the perception that as an Asian American, I've never suffered racism, then I tell you the story of the internment. I tell you about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I tell you about the rash of hundreds of anti-Asian violent acts since the onset of COVID. In other words, I get you all to participate in what we call everywhere these days a diversity training. That is, I try to get you to not be possessed of racism. And I train the racism out of you. If that's one approach of anti-racism, then the other approach of anti-racism is those who cannot be educated, cannot be corrected, get called out, canceled, and pushed to the outer margins of polite society. So we either are going to correct you and educate you, or we're going to push you from our view. One other example or instance of what I'm calling the standard view of racism has to do with how we sometimes tell the story, the very dark history of American chattel slavery. Sometimes when we revisit those old histories and see the brutalities in its systemic nature, its violence, its brutalities, we tell a story when the standard account of racism is infecting us. We tell the story of something like this. Well, the reason we enslaved those people, the reason we raped them, we murdered them, we all but exterminated them, is because we're under a kind of metaphysical mistake. We didn't know they were human. But now that we know they're human, we can change our behavior. Now that we can train ourselves by way of some universal diversity training, we now realize, oh, it was a mistake. We thought that which was human was not human. These are all versions of the standard account. And what I want to say is this story is too convenient. It's too simplistic. It always projects the racist and the racist out there and allows a whole lot of us, certainly this one, to wash their hands clean of the persistence and power of American racism. So if that's a standard account, I'm sure you're wondering, what's the other account? We can begin by thinking about how we tell this story about American chattel slavery. And I begin by saying this: the tragedy of American chattel slavery is not that we had made a metaphysical mistake. The tragedy of American chattel slavery isn't that we had confused some humans for someone less than human. The tragedy of American chattel slavery is not that we had made a mistake and we didn't know something. The tragedy of American chattel slavery is that we enslaved those who we could not fail to know were fully human. That is the tragedy. It's not that we were under a mistake or a delusion. It's the fact that these folks lived so proximate to us with such an enduring and powerful and irrepressible humanity that we could not have failed to know that they were human. And yet, we enslaved and raped and murdered anyways. That's the tragedy. Not a metaphysical mistake, not some bit of information we were lacking. We had all the information we could ever need. We could not yield before that information. The tragedy of American slavery isn't that we made a mistake about the inhumanity of enslaved persons. The tragedy is that we dehumanized ourselves in treating people who were fully human as less than human. Racial capitalism is a discourse that was developed primarily out of the Black radical tradition. If you want to know who the key figures are, think of people like Du Bois, versions of Baldwin, Oliver Cromwell Cox, Angela Davis more recently, Adolph Reed, Karen and Barbara Fields. For these folks, racism isn't primarily about, say, bad ideas that I'm possessed of, that sometimes rise to the level of structures and systems. Racism for these folks are always about structures and systems. And they produce the racist mentalities, the diseased imaginations necessary to facilitate a system of utterly breathtaking injustice and inequality. It is engineering a world where my primary disposition to everything else that I said earlier in this lecture is gift. Instead of looking at gift and thinking about the gratitude that one should have toward God, it is looking at the world, whether it be a human person, a piece of land, some part and stretch of the ocean, and instead of saying, how do I praise God for that? How do I honor the gift structure of that person, that thing, that creature? Is it instead saying something like this? How do I make use of that? How do I commodify that? How do I, in the language of Reverend Dr. King, how do I thingify that? How do I make use of it? How do I strip it of its life in order to render it profitable to me? It is, in the language of St. Augustine, it is the privation, the predatory behavior towards that which God gave commonly to say, it's mine, it's my own. It's my precious. What race does in this kind of activity is it facilitates it, it enables it by justifying it. Race and racial capitalism are, as the Black Marxists taught us, the ultimate gaslighting maneuver. It is to blame the oppressed, to lay blame for their suffering on them. It is to say, it's not us, it's not something we're doing, it's something about who you are. It's something natural to you, something essential to you, that you should be an enslaved person, that you should be a migrant, that you don't belong in this country, that you don't belong in this neighborhood, that you do not and never will belong in this family. It's something natural to you. It's not about me. It's not about these systems and structures. It's something about you, something natural to you, something essential to you, something about your race. Race was a fantasy created to facilitate exploitation and domination. It is a concept that doesn't sometimes, but necessarily pit people against one another. It is a form of power that has been so entrenched, not simply in our society, but in our psyche, that we can't not think in these terms. And of course, it would have to be like this, because what other myth could facilitate something like American chattel slavery and its seemingly unending afterlives? Racial capitalism is a mentality, an emotion, a posture to the world. It works something like this. I drive around my city of Waco like you may drive around your city of Pittsburgh. You notice in certain parts of the city, they got great schools, easy access to healthcare, right? The zoning laws seem to always tilt in their favor. You drive to other parts of the city, and it's the exact opposite. No visible healthcare, no financial infrastructure except for what? Payday lending schemes there to rip people off end to end. No regular healthcare. No buildings that even promise the potential for healthcare. You break an arm, you catch cancer, you get COVID, good luck. One study showed that African Americans in this country live and have lived in their entire history in a perpetual pandemic set of conditions, primarily because of an inability to get access to basic health care. And so you're driving around the city, you see this, and you see that, and instead of asking the most logical, natural, reasonable question and say, how have we organized our world that we have this and versus that? And why don't those people have what those people naturally, as a matter of course, have? Instead, we dropped in what Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, the story of race. And we said, the reason you all suffer what you all suffer, it's on you. It's natural and essential to who you are. It's even biological. It is because you are brown or black or red or yellow or whatever. This is a system that perpetuates this exploitation and domination. What I described earlier as looking at the world and sucking it and stripping it of every commodified value you can imagine. What race does is it allows that to go on in perpetuity, because it gaslights the oppressed and the dominated and the exploited and turns our attention from these structures and systems to people's race. It allows it to go on and on. The answer to the question, why is racism so powerful? Why does racism persist? The answer is one we don't want to think about. It is not the convenient, simple one of racism out there. The reason racism persists is because racism works. It enables the society we live in, the benefits we access as a matter of course. It enables our lives, our houses, our properties, our cars, our relationship to the world and others, and it does so in perpetuity. This is not going to be as easy as looking for those folks out there. It is going to require us to begin thinking about all the structures and systems in which we live, perpetuate, and benefit from. So I've offered 3 Ps as a way to think about the grammar of Christian mission and evangelism. I've offered a picture of how I think racism works in this world, that it is a system of exploitation and domination that produces the diseased imagination of what we call racism. I have said that it persists because it works, and that it will allow racism to go on in perpetuity. What then? How do we respond? You might be asking, so what? What do I do? How do I live? How do I put one foot in front of the other if I don't want to be simply a beneficiary, a perpetrator, a person that continues it, makes it live on through me? I want to say that what God offers, the basic givens of Christian discipleship, give us much of what we need. We need only live into the courage of that life. There's a part of San Francisco called the Bayview Hunters Point, part of San Francisco. Most of you, if you've gone to San Francisco as a tourist, you probably have never been to BVHP, the Bayview, as most of the folks there call it. It's on the outer margins, the southwest of the city. In its history, the Bayview was largely understood as a kind of commercial resource for the center city, for the center of the city. It was understood as offering the raw materials, the labor, the work necessary for powering the metropole that would become not simply a metropole of the American West Coast, not simply a metropole within US cities, but a metropole of the entire Pacific Rim. And because of the power of technology, a metropole and a centered metropole of the entire world. If you go to San Francisco and you expect that San Francisco, say the San Francisco of liberal culture in Silicon Valley, you'll completely miss this part of the city. My friends that live there tell me it's literally left off the map. If you get a tourist map of San Francisco, you won't even know that Bayview Hunters Point exists and has existed entirely in its history as part of the city. You probably also won't know that this part of the city is referred to as Black San Francisco. And no wonder it exists on the margins of many imaginations. You probably won't also know that it has been the site of extraordinary. The phrase I used earlier was breathtaking, literally the taking of breath, forms of environmental racism. After World War II, when the US government needed to decommission, as it was ramping up its nuclear program, as it needed to decommission nuclear weaponry, they decommissioned it in the Bayview. There were generations of cancer, generations of illness. The government probably thought, why not? Who's there? Who's going to raise a fuss? And this is after the first Black San Franciscans came to San Francisco because the US government during World War II needed what? Cheap labor. Bring in the Black folks. We enslaved them before. Maybe we can get away with it again. It is the principle within racial capitalism that exploitation begets exploitation. It is the idea that we have these markets in which we render people simply labor say enslaved or just barely enslaved. And then instead of, once we discover that, correcting systems and structures, we leave that standing. And lo and behold, someone else comes along and says, how do I make use of that? And so that's the history of Bayview Hunters Point. Most recently, the forms of exploitation are things like this, and this is a literal story I discovered in the research. Asian bankers walking around Bayview Hunters Point, knocking on your door and saying, hey, I will give you, literally in my briefcase, I will give you $500,000 for your house. You need only sign over the bill and I will give you this cash. What they don't say, the house is worth $1.2 million. These Asian American business folks realize the most valuable commodity in San Francisco, anyone that has been there knows this, is property, is real estate. Exploitation, beginning exploitation. These are literal aftermarkets of a political economy that dots the horizon with exploitation. One of the most powerful witnesses through Bayview Hunters Point, Black San Francisco, has been, as it has always been in American culture, the Black church. It is the Black church that have educated their people against these forms of piracy, of parasitic behavior, of privatization, as St. Augustine would say. A few years ago, there was a number of students, interestingly, Asian American. Asian Americans always figure interestingly in the American racial story because you're not quite sure where to put them. Are they perpetrators? Are they victims? So a group of students at Stanford University, which of course is near San Francisco, and Berkeley, which is across the way from San Francisco. They're all students that would fit what we call the model minority myth. They were raised Asian parents, study hard, get into the best universities, and indeed they did. One of the best private schools in America, one of the best public schools in America, Stanford University and Cal Berkeley. And their parents sent them there for the very promises of upward mobility that drove and motivated many of those families to come to America in the first place. But something happened for these kids at Stanford and Berkeley that their parents could have never anticipated. Something that shatters the model minority myth. They met Jesus. And Jesus taught them two things at once. That God is on the side, and uniquely on the side of the oppressed. And if you want God, you're gonna go too. They're taught to see the landscape of San Francisco not as the upward mobility of Silicon Valley, but the places where the Spirit really dwelt in the history of churches that had sustained their people for generations. And so these students from Stanford and Berkeley chose to live lives in proximity to these churches. They gave up their Silicon Valley jobs, which I can promise you came with substantial costs. They gave up locating in the wealthiest, most secluded parts of the political economy. And at the invitation of the Black church, started a church in mentorship with these other churches. The church exists today. You can look it up. It's called Redeemer Community Church. It's comprised of mostly, strangely, interestingly, Asian Americans. You know, those who you're not sure are there to rip you off for a bill of sale on your house, or there to share the genuine good news of Christ. They've started a church. The church has been there 20 years. They've raised their kids in the public schools. And in raising their kids over 2 decades in the public schools, they've come to see the rot running through the incredible forms of inequality in public education. From that, they ask their neighbors, what do you need? If we're going to be presence, if we're going to be Eucharistic presence in this world, if we are going to proclaim, If the proof is in the pudding, what do you need from us? Their neighbors came back and said, give us a school. Give us a school that our kids can go to school and learn and get ahead and get past these generations of poverty. So you could also look it up. There's a school called Rise Preparatory Academy in San Francisco. They created the school. They created a software company. They quit all their Silicon Valley jobs and took on much lower incomes to work on a software company that has genuinely just practices in how it relates to employees, how it thinks about time, how it thinks about schedules, how it thinks about life-work balance. They took their Silicon Valley brains and said, Jesus, here we are. Do something with this. They used the money from the software company to redistribute through the neighborhood, creating the school and creating a financial system that local residents, knowing that small businesses are the backbone of any community, the local residents, rather than going to financial institutions that have predatory behaviors towards citizens, think to share money for good. These people have been doing this for 20 years. In my research with them, what was most extraordinary to me about them was they never thought they were extraordinary. They said they did it for two reasons. They loved one another and they loved their neighbors. It just seemed the most natural thing to them. They believed in what I describe in a book, the divine economy, which was the first name that the church gave for the gospel. They believed that the divine economy made it such that no matter the minority counter witness, that justice and mercy are natural to this world because justice and mercy are natural to God. They live this way not because they think they're trying to make something happen. They live this way because they believe something has happened. And they've been swept up in the current of God's divine activity in this world. As amazing as these folks are, remember, they're not waiting for a revolution to start. They're simply leaning into, having learned in Bible study, listened in church, sang with their fellow congregants, met in prayer, thought about their life as not doing something good, but repenting of the privileges that they've been given in a racial capitalist society. They imagine themselves as living in justice and mercy that is natural to them because natural to God. So what does Christian mission and evangelism look like, given the truths and the constraints and entailments of proclamation, presence, and proof? It looks something like Redeemer Community Church. And my guess, churches all around here, churches like Lawndale Community in Chicago, churches who understand themselves living in a revolution that has caught them up. Thanks for your time. We have, I think, some time for conversation. Is that right? I'm sorry I went on for so long. I was hoping that you wouldn't have to be monologued to for so long. I really look forward to conversation afterwards, how you have thought about these questions, how you've reflected on them, how you've hopefully wrestled with them. And so I want to open it up to conversation with you all. There's a mic. I believe we have folks in the room that can use the mic. I believe we have folks online that can submit questions. So I invite anyone that wants to begin our discussion to please do so. And please come, if you're in the room, please come to the mic.
So I've been thinking about these kinds of issues for a long time. the story of the church in San Francisco, I did not understand how the former students, graduates, were supporting themselves and therefore this community. I mean, did they have tech jobs? Do they have trust funds? You know, whatever.
Most of them had regular jobs, as I described in Silicon Valley. Many of them were also trained as teachers. They quit those jobs. They started the software company, and they used the money to pay for their lives and redistribute through the neighborhood.
So they set up this software company following principles I assumed that would be compatible with what their work in the neighborhood. And then, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but they also, you can imagine, I mean, it's a great question, right? They also have to be resourceful. They're not making the salaries that they would have, and they live in a pretty expensive place. So many of them share houses together. I mean, large parts of our economy would be better if neighborhoods shared property, neighbors shared property, if we had more mixed income housing. And so they've been creative in what they've been willing to do. But this is where the proclamation of our lives as inhabiting and taking part in the life of Christ enables a life of what I describe as self-dispossession, right? Giving away rather than gaining and gaining greater access.
Okay, thank you.
We have one online? Yeah.
We've got several questions from the folks online. And folks online are coming to us tonight from Philadelphia to Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, Columbus, Ohio, Dumaguete, Philippines, Detroit, Michigan, Los Angeles, and a variety of other places. Here's the first question. If mission is understood as an extension of Christ's body, or incarnational or sacramental, there's a dangerous temptation of confusing the incarnated Christ with his church that may lead us to triumphalism or exclusivism. This is the danger of progressivism, the white man's burden. We are Christ's body, but the others, black, colored, Indians, Asians, LGBTQ, women, Palestinians, etc., are not. How do we avoid this temptation?
I'm not quite sure I understand the "are not" part, but I take the main part of the question to be, what do we do with the principal distinction between Christ's church and incarnate Christ? And part of the difficulty here, as I understand, and maybe this goes back to the notion of proclamation and presence, is the confusion of those things. To think my presence is Christ leads to not simply violence, but the justification of violence insofar as my political orders or what have you are underwritten because they are what Christ was. I think that names precisely and elegantly the perennial challenge in front of us, why it is in fact that missions and evangelism have taken on bad names. The challenge, it strikes me as though, is not giving up the proximity of the church to Christ while also holding the principal distinction between the two. At the end of the day, we are about witness. And the recognition that God calls us to be witnesses while not being at all surprised that we are rather frail ones. I mean, this is, to me, one of the great mysteries of all the peoples of the earth. Why did he call these ones? Why did God call these ones? It couldn't be because God was so limited in his knowledge that he would be surprised that we would mess it up. God called us, knowing in fact that we would. That was my point about on the night of the betrayal, yet still God still gives us. So how do we hold that history where the conflation between God and Christ has led to untold and unending violence, while also not giving up also the principled commitment that God uses God's people to witness to God's self. Holding those two in tension, I think, is a much harder thing to do than simply point out the problems that have come along. It's a great question.
We got one over here.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could clarify your perspective on the actual cost of oppression. So it's the way I interpreted what you're saying is that oppression is almost like a downward trickle, where the further down you go, the more expensive it is, and the higher up you are, the less expensive it is. But to use your example, if you look at chattel slavery, right? The true cost of chattel slavery was it demolished the Southern economy from 1860 well into the 1960s. So that is expensive for the oppressor too. And then, for example, too, if you go down to my mother's house in a place in Mobile, Alabama, they actually have two airports sitting next to each other. One is an old military air base, and the next is the regional airport. They didn't want to build an international airport at the abandoned Air Force Base because it was in the black neighborhood, which really cost the whole city the ability to be an international export. And I was wondering if you could answer that from a Christian perspective too.
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean by the expenses and how the expenses are accrued. I mean, by one metric or measurement, certainly some people bear certain kinds of costs, but there are costs across the board. As I described, these are forms of inhumanity that render the oppressors inhumane. It robs them of their own humanity. There are also material consequences for racism, that is clear. Many studies show that at the end of chattel slavery, it increasingly became a more costly endeavor than the alternatives. The evidence that what has been shown, I mean, one story we often tell about chattel in American history is that there was an economic or political economy that ran for a long time. It was something like feudalism. It had, say, unenlightened financial technologies. Part of that was something like enslavement. Later on, in our maturity, we came to discover capitalism as a better way to go. Rather, historians in the last 20 years have told a far different story. The financial technologies of capitalism emerged often directly out of chattel. And so this was a system that bred, right, the forms of enslavement at the same time that it developed most of the technologies that we consider just part and parcel of, say, financial systems of capitalism. The costs were across the board, but to a degree that some people can know and others cannot. Oftentimes, the people who were most interested in these forms of expropriation and extraction were paying great costs, but they did not know because the way they understood the metrics were quite complicated, right? And so Du Bois himself has a really interesting account of this in Black Reconstruction, where he describes a kind of planner class that was completely unable to track with the new forms of financial technologization that might actually improve their own holdings. And yet they're so committed to the slavery system that they couldn't quite get there. So yeah, it's spread across the thing. The other form of the cost that Du Bois narrates in Black Reconstruction is this moment where he imagines the staging of democracy against industry. And for poor white folks, it's the realization for a moment of populist uprising that it is actually in pairing with other oppressed peoples, though differently and often severely differently oppressed people, that the routes to liberation might come. And yet those folks also give it up. So the costs are across the board.
We got one here, and then Hunter will go to you next.
So I'm thinking about the myth of what America is now calling reparations. And I'm thinking about the large swaths of communities that have white church in white community, faithful folks, but are struggling with what does living, I think in your words, the repentance of their privilege. What does that look like in their world when they may never see a person of color except on TV? And they're struggling with that myth that reparations is a zero-sum game, that I must live, give up all that I have and have inherited and or been the beneficiary of.
Yeah, this is a complicated question. There are parts of our society, and I don't want to absolve myself in thinking I may not be part of this. There are parts of our society that we cannot argue with. It's not a matter of argument. It is a distinction Kierkegaard makes between Socrates and Christ. Some people don't need to be instructed or taught. They need to be saved. There are segments of our population that the argument for reparations will always come as a threat and an affront rather than as an invitation. Reparation seems to me to be God's way of saying you can live life more abundantly. You're just confused about the metrics of abundance. And you're paying costs that you cannot imagine because you've imagined your world and put it together in a certain kind of way. But I also want to say, if I take the force of your question about this group of folks, one author I read refers to this, say, posture, this hermeneutic towards the world as a willful ignorance. I want to say that I'm equally worried about the folks that you talk about, that you've rightly pointed out, as the vast swath of people, say, on the middle left. Think about something like affirmative action. So affirmative action, when it was first unfurled as a plan in the 50s and 60s, was imagined as a reparations, redistributive, political economic intervention. It was saying we have systems that need redress, and the only way we could do so is by redistributing. But Bakke said, we're not going to take that affirmative action. What we're going to do is take an affirmative action tied largely to an educational program called diversity. We switched out one for the other, and there's debates in the literature about why this was the case. But suddenly, affirmative action became about access to America's most elite institutions, with the idea that if we could diversify the Harvard universities with, say, people of color, we could feel better about the larger society not being more equitably related to. And so the problem that you're talking about, the resistance to reparations or repentance, is sophisticated. We are incredibly clever animals in our delusions. And so it is not simply I worry about the white church that has its willful ignorance and completely their response to the desperation of the world is to make sure they get theirs. I'm equally worried about the strategies, say, of those who are driven by benevolence, who have confused the matter as well. These are equally challenging to me.
So I'm also asking to put the faithful one, the one who sits in a moment like this and receives what you have to say and has that cut to the heart, but leave here and go back to that community, wanting to do something, ready to proclaim in their worshiping community, but has no idea of what presence looks like when they're removed from the space that might, directly impact somebody's life, of a person of color's life.
Sorry, I caught the wrong force. Maybe there are several forces to your question. So if I've talked about, say, the willful ignorance of a certain population, what do we do with the genuine receptivity? One thing I want to say is it can't be about white guilt. There's a place for white people feeling guilty. There's a place for people recognizing their complicity, their advantage, their privilege. But that there needs to be a quick circuit from that to action. We've had enough white guilt. My worry about a lot of diversity strategies is they drum up a lot of white guilt, but they work a little bit like evangelical weekend retreats. That is, they're really great. They drum up a lot of energy. People come to Jesus on Saturday night. They go home on Sunday, back to their regular lives. And so the example I try to give through a Redeemer, say what Lawndale is doing in Chicago, is that these are practical things that people can go and do. Go and be parts of these communities. One of the rules of Pastor Brooks's church in Lawndale is, if you want to be part of this community, you got to live in this neighborhood. So that's why Dr. Perkins' 3 R's, right? Relocation, redistribution, reconciliation, begins with the action of considering relocation. Begins with the actions of redistribution, imagining what is my money doing and what is it doing for me versus what it is doing for others. How I drive. I had a professor in grad school who refused to get a car because he realized that the point of freeways in many cities is to make sure that the wealthy avoid the conditions of their wealth. And so what are the daily practices? And as I said, I think a lot of these are within reach within the terms of discipleship. Think about basic practices like the examen of scripture study that lay bare the ways that we are willfully ignorant. Partnerships, and I think these are present across churches, partnerships with other churches. So you can imagine that church partnering with another church, being tutored, apprenticed to how the world works beyond what they knew. And so there are all kinds of ways the life of repentance can turn people practically. And again, I want to think that Christianity has many avenues into this. They're the terms of discipleship. But as the other force of your question, if the willful ignorance takes over, if the zero-sum imagination takes over, if all the news and untruth of the media takes over, then we're going to be largely where we're at. So the pathways, I think, are readily available, but we don't lean into them oftentimes.
We have another question from online. Your lecture and your book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, share a particular tone of inclusivity, grace, and humility that are unusual in academic tomes. Can you share with us how that tone was developed in your life?
It's kind of a compliment and calling it a tome. It's a very gracious and generous comment. Thank you. There's probably some things that you said about me that my wife would not recognize, but I'm going to share this video with her. It came out of pain. I'm Asian American, and I came to America. I'll say a little bit about this tonight. There's an event tonight that we would love to have folks a part of. I came to America as a war refugee at the end of the Vietnam War, after 3 wars that America had with people who looked like me. They were taught to think that I was dangerous, perilous. And so I received racism as a daily affair. You can imagine I was quite surprised when I went to university and was told that the racism I had experienced, the exploitation my people had endured, did not count, did not matter, or if it counted or mattered, it mattered or counted less. I studied enough American history to recognize that parts of that were true, that the soil and the dirt of this land is soaked in the blood of First Nation indigenous people, of generations of Africans and African Americans. And so there was something right about this act in solidarity. But there was also something about the experience of being first marginalized by racism and then being marginalized by anti-racism. And this book was my attempt to make sense of that life, to make sense of what I imagine I'm not the only one in this room in thinking that the strategies that we have oftentimes in our best efforts in good faith are not the strategies that are going to yield to liberation. In fact, that they might be pushing in the opposite direction. And so the book was my attempt to think with others as a way to think our way out of the present. Yeah, so it is, in the language one of my friends, the book is the attempt to turn pain into power. And in that sense, simply to sit on the shoulders of other people who have done that much better and for much longer.
We have one question over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Casey. I'm a first-year seminarian here. My question is how would those who are discerning calls to ministry professions like myself, how should we prepare ourselves to have conversations with potential congregation members, potential future mission workers working in classrooms and academic environments, as in religion departments? How do we faithfully engage with people who may say, "Oh, this is some radical proposal that is being proposed at these radical seminaries," and instead, like, how do we have faithful, peaceful? How do we prepare ourselves to have faithful and peaceful conversations? That this is the way that the church has been. That this is the way that the church has worked in the past, and like with the divine economy of redistributing the wealth and sharing with others. How do we as people discerning calls to that ministry faithfully engage with conversations with potential colleagues and congregants?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? One of the laments I think a lot of us have had, especially around seminary education, is the growth we see, or the decline, more like, we see in people who feel called to church ministry, who can still recognize the church as bearing some witness to God, given the history. And there's many terms for this. Sociologists spend their days studying this. And sometimes it's called evangelicalism, or the nuns, or the people who depart from church because of church. I think one of the most important things we do is we listen. They have good reasons. They have really good arguments. Their intuitions are very often right, and more right than those of us who remain. I mean, think about, say, so I've talked about the proof in the pudding, such that it may not be true if it's not lived out. Think about something like church abuse. And here I certainly mean the Catholic sexual abuse that's occurred, but I also name the tradition of my institution, Baptist churches. The Houston Chronicle wrote a series of articles that recounted nearly 800 cases of clerical abuse in Baptist churches that was facilitated by the denominations. And what is abuse? Abuse, at least as it occurs in the church, is the taking of the claim that our bodies belong to each other. That our bodies are gathered bodies around the one body of Christ. The baptismal and Eucharistic promise of that, it is the taking of that and the distortion, the ruination of it from the inside. It is the exploitation and the taking advantage of the very promise, the evidence the gospel might be true. If you're raised with some awareness of that, and those who are, they have every reason to think, indeed, the proof is in the pudding. There's nothing here for me. If we want to convince those folks, we're going to have some different pudding. And that's going to require lives like maybe this church, on the margins of these conversations, that finds itself swept up by the Spirit, that chooses into different lives. I want to say that the decline of hope for that church, for the possibility of folks like the folks in this room who are extraordinarily gifted and passionate and dedicated, that they might have the same hope for the church that they do for some form, which I deeply believe in, community organizing, or a USAID, or a company, that they would have some hope that that which Scripture calls the bride of Christ might actually be so. And my fear that if we don't believe that, then it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. How do we cultivate what this seminary has been doing for a long time? The imagination to imagine that the church has not been abandoned, even though it has given God every reason to abandon it. That the Spirit remains in the same way that on the very night of his betrayal, Christ said, "Take, eat, receive." At least that's what I'd like to imagine PTS is doing.
Let's do, Hunter, one more question from online, and then we'll see if there's maybe time for one more in the room.
Great, thank you. A couple of three questions around your use of, or your mentioning of education as an epicenter of the struggle to move into resistance and proclamation. It seems to me that the loss of funding for public schools, especially in poor districts, is at the center of structural racism. What do you think about the charter school or school choice movement?
Oh. So we can think of charter. I mean, the point about zero sum is I mean, I cannot recommend enough Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, Miss McGee was a Yale-trained economist who worked at the Demos Project, which is one of the most impressive think tanks around democracy in America. She quit her job because she wanted to travel the country asking a very basic question. Why do poor white folks, she's an African-American woman, why do poor white folks consistently vote against their own best interest? And what she meant was, why do lower class white folks, folks in the underclass, vote against social services? And so she spent 3 years traveling the country asking this question of all kinds of folks. What she, if you've read the book, she begins with this really marvelous, amazing story. 1950s, the federal government forces desegregation on communities. One of the things that we had before desegregation, I didn't know this myself, was rather than people having individual pools, they had community pools. And once the white folks were told you couldn't have your own pool unless you're willing to share it with black folks, neighbors, people who actually had paid to have the pools, rather than share the pools, they poured cement into the pools. Rather than share the pools, they shuttered the pools. And she found this to be a rather precise analogy to white folks voting against their own best interests. She found that two things ruled those folks who voted, white folks who voted against social services that affects them aggregately way more than anyone else, because there's way more white people than a lot of other people. Two things drove them. One was the sense that social services are just for people of color, as if there are no white poor people in America. And secondly, they thought through a zero-sum analysis, that anything gained by black people is a loss for white people. What's amazing about Ms. McGee's portrayal in The Sum of Us is it maps on quite well to Black Reconstruction. It maps on quite well to Oliver Cromwell Cox's account, Class, and Race. It maps on quite well to Ruth Gilmore's work, Paul Gilroy's work, the Black radicals that I mentioned earlier. This story, Noel Ignatius, How the Irish Became White. These are persistent stories where race is dropped into a community in a way that divides what otherwise might be a unified fight against racial capital. So the question of education then is often mapped onto this, say, atmospheric set of realities. In this way, charter schools are pitted against public schools. Those are both public funds. Now I get it. The more you give to a charter school, the less you give to the public school. But charter schools, you can think about them differently, I think. You can think of them as alternative imaginations for public monies, forms of redistribution in other ways. So I would like to think that the fight doesn't need to be pitted against public schools. And I admit I could just be wrong on this. Public schools over against public charter schools. It is rather, let's just say the problem happens way upstream from there. Think about, say, coding in housing, coding for rental gaps, coding for how mortgages are imagined, coding for, say, how kids are spread in certain kinds of communities, spread out in certain kinds of communities. So there's a whole host of issue that the charter school network has been forced to carry the entire burden of. But I think we want to step back and ask this larger question. How did we get to the zero-sum analysis imagination in the first place? I mean, one of the fundamental tenets we have to acknowledge about capitalism is the notion of scarcity. Scarcity is the fulcrum upon which profit motivation is driven. It happens to run theologically counter to the theological claim of abundance. What I started out, that our existence as such is gratuity, excess, abundance. Think about, I know we're out of time, but think about the three paradigmatic instances of sin in Scripture, or at least three paradigmatic: Adam and Eve, David and Bathsheba, the prodigal sons / father. Each of those are instances where the temptation is to believe, I don't have enough. And in thinking I don't have enough, that God will not take care of me, then of course it's hoarding. I think about the impulsive nature. If you're at a buffet and I say, the buffet's gonna close in 10 minutes, what do? You make a beeline to the buffet. Your eyes are bigger than your mouth. It's the zero-sum logic. It is heresy relative to the claim of creaturely existence.
There's a final comment, Scott. I don't know if I can put it in here. This is from a former student of Dr. Tran's, who says, to the seminarian's question, Dr. Tran once told me this in class once when I said that Dr. Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination, was the kind of book I would in my wildest dreams dream of writing. The quote was this: I'd much rather you see a form of community that lives that out. That's our call in whatever context.
If the only thing you hear from this is you read Willie James Jennings' The Christian Imagination, you'll have come away richer for it. So that's what I think about that masterpiece.
Thank you, Dr. Tran. Let's